The Democratic bid. As Republican President Donald Trump sets out on the campaign road for his second term as the leader of the free world, he will have many opponents and obstacles in front of him, most notably from the Democratic Party. With over a dozen Democratic candidates hoping to officially garner the bid from their party, there's a lot to learn about each prospective runner. Who will come out top? Let's take a look at the electoral process and the potential candidates who are hoping to gain control of the most prominent and powerful post in the world. The 2020 United States presidential election, scheduled for Tuesday, November 3rd, 2020, will be the 59th quadrennial US presidential election. Voters will select presidential electors who, in turn, on December 14th, 2020, will either elect a new president and vice president or re-elect the incumbents. In the event that no candidate receives the minimum 270 electoral votes needed to win the election, the United States House of Representatives will select the president from 3 candidates that received the most electoral votes, and the United States Senate will select the vice president from the candidates that received the 2 highest totals. The series of presidential primary elections and caucuses are likely to be held during the first 6 months of 2020. This nominating process is also an indirect election, where voters cast ballots selecting a slate of delegates to a political party's nominating convention, who then in turn elect their party's presidential nominee. The winner of the 2020 presidential election is scheduled to be inaugurated on January the 20th, 2021. Article 2 of the United States Constitution states that for a person to serve as President of the United States, the individual must be a natural-born citizen of the United States, at least 35 years old, and a United States resident for at least 14 years. Candidates for the presidency typically seek the nomination of one of the various political parties of the United States, in which case each party develops a method, such as a primary election, to choose the candidate the party deems best suited to run for the position. The primary elections are usually indirect elections, where voters cast ballots for a slate of party delegates pledged to a particular candidate. The party's delegates then officially nominate a candidate to run on the party's behalf. The nominee typically chooses a vice presidential running mate to form that party's presidential ticket, who is then ratified by the delegates, with the exception of the Libertarian Party, which nominates its vice presidential candidate by delegate vote, regardless of the nominee's preference. The general election in November is also an indirect election, in which voters cast ballots for a slate of members of the Electoral College. These electors then directly elect the president and vice president. In August 2018, the Democratic National Committee voted to disallow superdelegates from voting on the first ballot of the nominating process, beginning with the 2020 election. This would require a candidate to win a majority of pledged delegates from the assorted primary elections in order to win the party's nomination. The last time this did not occur was the nomination of Adlai Stevenson II at the 1952 Democratic National Convention. The 22nd Amendment to the Constitution states that an individual cannot be elected to the presidency more than twice. This prohibits former presidents Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama from being elected president again. Former President Jimmy Carter, having served a single term as president, is not constitutionally prohibited from being elected to another term in the 2020 election. The age group of what will then be people in the 18 to 45-year-old bracket is expected to represent just under 40% of the United States eligible voters in 2020. It is expected that more than 30% of eligible American voters will be non-white. A bipartisan report indicates that changes in voter demographics since the 2016 election could impact the results of the 2020 election. African Americans, Hispanics, Asians, and other ethnic minorities, as well as whites with a college degree, are expected to all increase their percentage of national eligible voters by 2020, while whites without a college degree will decrease. This shift is potentially an advantage for the Democratic nominee. However, due to geographical differences, this could still lead to President Trump, or a different Republican nominee, winning the Electoral College while still losing the popular vote, possibly by an even larger margin than in 2016. Additionally, Washington, D.C. may lower its voting age from 18 to 16. Legislation was introduced by City Councilman Charles Allen in April 2018, with a public hearing in June and a vote by the end of the year. Unlike other cities with a voting age of 16, such as Berkeley, California, this would allow 16 and 17-year-olds to vote for President of the United States for the first time in 2020. Allen said that he was inspired by the high school students that participated in the March for Our Lives, which occurred at the Capitol in March. The presidential election will occur simultaneously with elections to the Senate and the House of Representatives. Several states will also hold state gubernatorial and state legislative elections. Following the election, the United States House will redistribute the seats among the 50 states based on the results of the 2020 United States Census, and the states will conduct a redistricting of congressional and state legislative districts. In most states, the governor and the state legislature conduct the redistricting, although some states have redistricting commissions. And often a party that wins a presidential election experiences a coattail effect that also helps other candidates of that party win elections. Therefore, the party that wins the 2020 presidential election could also win a significant advantage in the drawing of new congressional and state legislative districts that would stay in effect until the 2032 elections. The New York Times and The New Yorker named Amy Klobuchar as one of the women most likely to become the first female president of the United States, and MSNBC and The New Yorker named her as a possible nominee to the U.S. Supreme Court. The statistical analysis website 538.com has rated Klobuchar as the top, male or female, candidate who's getting more home state support than their party, which shows she is successfully appealing to voters outside her base. On February the 10th, 2019, Klobuchar announced her candidacy in the 2020 Democratic Party presidential primaries. She has said that she uses humour as one way to distinguish herself amongst the many other Democratic candidates in the 2020 campaign. Klobuchar's political positions have generally been in line with modern American liberalism. She is pro-choice on abortion, supports LGBT rights and Obamacare, and was critical of the Iraq War. According to GovTrack, Klobuchar passed more legislation than any other senator by the end of the 114th Congress in late 2016. According to Congress.gov, as of December 16, 2018, she had sponsored or co-sponsored 111 pieces of legislation that became law. During the 115th Congress, she voted in line with Trump's position on legislation 31.1% of the time. On November 6, 2017, Andrew Yang filed with the Federal Election Commission, FEC, to run for President of the United States in 2020. His campaign proposes a $1,000 a month freedom dividend to all U.S. citizens over the age of 18, a form of universal basic income, in response to predictions of large-scale worker displacement due to technological automation. The other two central elements of Yang's platform are Medicare for All and human-centered capitalism. His campaign slogan is Humanity First, which calls attention to his belief that automation of many key industries is one of the biggest threats facing the workforce. Over 100 policies are listed on Yang's campaign website. Yang is a proponent of a carbon tax and bringing the United States back into the Paris Climate Agreement. He supports legislation against discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, and has pledged to appoint pro-choice judges. A New York Times article about his campaign described various new policies Yang proposes, such as a department focused on regulating the addictive nature of media, a White House psychologist, making Election Day a national holiday, and to stem corruption, increasing the salaries of federal regulators but limiting their private work after they leave public service. Yang has said that he became an advocate of a universal basic income after reading American futurist Martin Ford's book, Rise of the Robots, Technology and the Threat of a Jobless Future, which deals with the impact of automation and artificial intelligence on the job market and economy. Yang is at least the third American of East Asian descent to run for President of the United States, after Hiram Fong and Patsy Mink. As of June 28, 2019, Yang has received donations from over 130,000 donors across at least 20 US states, thereby meeting the requirements to be included in the first and second rounds of the debates for Democratic presidential primary candidates, and the donor requirement for the third and fourth rounds of debates. The Democratic National Committee randomly determined that Yang would participate in the second night of the first debate, which took place on June 27th. During his first debate, Yang was asked only 2 questions and allowed to speak for 2 minutes and 56 seconds, the least time of any candidate. He claimed that his microphone malfunctioned, initially suggesting to the debate moderators that technical difficulties might have occurred. An NBC spokesman said, "At no point during the debate was any candidate's microphone turned off or muted. But Yang and his supporters have provided video evidence they claim shows Yang speaking up but not being heard." Yang's campaign supporters, known informally as the Yang Gang, have brought attention to his campaign on Reddit, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and other social media platforms through the use of memes and viral campaigning. On February 19th, 2019, Bernie Sanders announced on Vermont Public Radio that he would seek the Democratic Party's nomination for President of the United States in the 2020 election. On the same day, he announced his campaign in an interview with John Dickerson on CBS This Morning and in an email to his supporters. Sanders had declined the Vermont Democratic Party nomination for the U.S. Senate in 2006, 2012, and 2018, which caused an unsuccessful legal challenge to his candidacy for the Democratic presidential nomination in 2016. Along with his 2019 campaign announcement, he said he would abide by a new Democratic Party rule for presidential candidates and would affirm his membership in that party. On March 5, 2019, he signed a formal statement, known as a loyalty pledge, that he is a member of the Democratic Party and will serve as a Democrat if elected. News reports noted that the day before, he had signed paperwork to run as an independent for re-election to his Senate seat in 2024. Sanders is a self-described democratic socialist and progressive who admires the Nordic model of social democracy and has been a proponent of workplace democracy. In November 2015, he gave a speech at Georgetown University about his view of democratic socialism, including its place in the policies of Presidents Franklin D. Roosevelt and Lyndon B. Johnson. In defining what democratic socialism means to him, Sanders said, "I don't believe government should take over the grocery store down the street or own the means of production. But I do believe that the middle class and the working families who produce the wealth of America deserve a decent standard of living, and that their incomes should go up, not down. I do believe in private companies that thrive and invest and grow in America, companies that create jobs here, rather than companies that are shutting down in America and increasing their profits by exploiting low-wage labour abroad. Based on Sanders' positions and votes throughout his political career, Noam Chomsky and Thomas Frank have described Sanders as a New Dealer. In late 2018, speculation began that Beto O'Rourke might run in the United States presidential election in 2020. Prior to the midterm elections, the New Republic said O'Rourke's Senate campaign was the beginning of a bid for the presidency, despite calling it journalistic hedging, or a justification for the media extensively covering a candidate who is expected to lose his race. Democratic strategist Maria Cardona said he has name recognition, a widely successful fundraising operation, a young, fresh face with a sprinkling of woke, a cool persona, a new perspective. He speaks Spanish and would be an exciting and upbeat candidate. The possibility of an O'Rourke candidacy made some Democratic Party donors hesitate to commit to other candidates. On March 13, El Paso TV station KTSM-TV reported that O'Rourke had decided to run for president in 2020. O'Rourke confirmed speculation the following day by announcing that he was entering the presidential race. According to Politico, during his presidential race, O'Rourke has been presenting his 2018 loss to Cruz as a prominent selling point. Political analysts classify O'Rourke as a progressive liberal, neoliberal, or centrist. During his time in Congress, O'Rourke was a member of the New Democrat Coalition, a pro-business member organisation. National Journal gave O'Rourke a composite ideology of 85% liberal and 15% conservative in 2013. Describing himself, O'Rourke has said that he does not know where he falls on the political spectrum. He has sponsored bipartisan bills, as well as broken with his party on issues like trade. GovTrack placed O'Rourke near the ideological centre of the Democratic Party. The American Civil Liberties Union gave him an 88% rating, while the United States Chamber of Commerce, a more conservative group, gave him a 47% rating. According to 538, which tracks congressional voting records, O'Rourke voted in line with Donald Trump 30.1% of the time during the 115th Congress. Bill Deblasio. On May 16, 2019, Bill Deblasio announced that he would seek the Democratic nomination for president after releasing a YouTube video in which he stated, "I'm Bill Deblasio and I'm running for president because it's time we put working people first." He is the first incumbent mayor of New York City to run for president since John Lindsay, who ran for the Democratic nomination in 1972. His candidacy was described as a long shot by the New York Times, which cited his low national poll numbers and inconsistent approval ratings in New York City. In 2014, Deblasio released a report dedicated to better transit for New York City. Some of the ideas brought up in the report were to rebuild Penn Station, Madison Square Garden, create more bus rapid transit routes, and a Vision Zero initiative to reduce traffic-related deaths in the city. While the de Blasio administration planned on increasing the rate at which bicycle racks were added in the city, the annual rate has instead fallen by 42% compared to the Bloomberg administration, reaching a new average of 1,633 new racks per year. John Orcutt, a spokesman for Bike New York, said, "Everybody's talking about city bikes and scooters, but it's the humble bike rack that needs more attention." When de Blasio appointed Minerva Tantoko to be the city's chief technology officer in the fall of 2014, He said her goal would be to develop and implement a coordinated strategy for technology and innovation, for how this city as a whole is going to approach the role of technology in our everyday lives, in our economy, in our schools, in our civic participation. Along with Governor Cuomo, Deblasio supported moving Amazon's headquarters to Long Island City in the Amazon HQ2 search, and worked with Cuomo to develop a benefits package to Amazon from New York City and state public funds, totaling $2.988 billion. In November 2018, Long Island City was selected as one of 2 sites for HQ2, along with Crystal City in Virginia, directly outside of Washington, D.C. The selection of Long Island City as a site for Amazon's HQ2 was controversial before and after Amazon's selection, and protested by local residents, community organizations, and politicians. After receiving pushback, Amazon withdrew their plans to open HQ2 in Long Island City on February 14, 2019. Deblasio later criticized Amazon's decision. A key point of Deblasio's tenure has been building more affordable housing, with a goal of building 200,000 units of affordable housing. However, though his plan passed the City Council, it has been very controversial. Groups like New York Communities for Change have come out against aspects of the plan, arguing that it promotes gentrification. Related to this goal, in April 2017, the state government renewed the 421, a tax abatement program after a deal was made between unions and developers on wages in qualifying construction projects. The program seeks to encourage the development of affordable housing in otherwise market-rate buildings by offering developers tax breaks to include such units in their new buildings. The old program had expired in January 2016, and Deblasio stated that the new program is better than the old one. Deblasio's decision to deny the use of public space to several New York City charter schools provoked controversy. This decision overturned an arrangement made by the Bloomberg administration, which allowed for co-locations where charter schools were housed in public school buildings. The mayor also revoked $200 million of capital funding that had been earmarked for charter schools. The New York Times emphasized that Deblasio approved 14 charter school co-locations and denied approval for just 3, suggesting that the mayor is being unfairly cast as being opposed to charter schools. Approximately 2 months after the initial decision, the mayor's office announced that it had found space for the 3 schools. The city would lease 3 buildings from the Archdiocese of New York, which were previously used as Catholic schools, and will renovate and maintain the properties. The 3 charter schools are run by Success Academy Charter Schools. As mayor, Deblasio's signature initiative was the implementation of universal pre-K, the availability of publicly funded pre-kindergarten for all New York City residents. Deblasio sought to fund the program by increasing taxes on New York City residents earning $500,000 or more. Deblasio's initiative has seen an increase in universal pre-K enrollment in New York City through 2015, with over 70% of pre-K expansions happening within the zip codes of the city's poorest quartiles. In 2017, Deblasio proposed an expansion of the program to 3K to include 3-year-olds. Preschool for 3-year-olds would start in poorer neighborhoods, with the goal of covering the entire city if the state or federal governments provided funding. In 2015, Deblasio repealed a rule asking mohels to inform parents of the risks of matitza b'per, an oral circumcision ritual that was linked to 17 cases of infant herpes, brain damage, and 2 deaths since 2000. The rule, which had been passed by the city's Board of Health in 2012, under Bloomberg, required parents to sign a consent form and had been called an infringement on religious freedom by ultra-Orthodox Jewish leaders who sued the city in federal court and pressed their followers not to comply. After Deblasio installed allies and donors on the New York City's Board of Health, a new policy stated that the mohel could be banned for life if he tests positive to herpes and the DNA strain matches the infant's, but only after a child has been infected, and not in a situation where a mohel tests positive but his DNA strain does not match the infant's. It was revealed that the city did not disclose new infections. Since the change was made, several children were infected with the disease after undergoing the religious ritual. On February 14, 2019, while addressing a rally in New York City about combating anti-Semitism, Deblasio said, "Maybe some people don't realize it, but when they support the BDS movement, they are affronting the right of Israel to exist, and that is unacceptable." Deblasio condemned Ilhan Omar's remarks about Israel and pro-Israel lobbyists as absolutely unacceptable and illogical. Deblasio supports the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act that would allow relatives of victims of the September 11 attacks to sue Saudi Arabia for its government's alleged role in the attacks. In December 2018, Deblasio announced his support for marijuana legislation in New York City, calling it a once-in-a-generation opportunity to get an historic issue right for future New Yorkers. He worked with a marijuana task force to produce a report on licensing and regulation, which was released along with a letter of endorsement. On February 1, 2019, Cory Booker announced his campaign for the Democratic nomination for President of the United States in the 2020 presidential election. Before his announcement, he was widely speculated to run for president, but expressed uncertainty as to whether he would run. The same month, Booker announced his campaign. Governor Phil Murphy, U.S. Senator Bob Menendez, and every Democratic member of the House of Representatives from New Jersey endorsed Booker. Booker held a campaign kickoff rally in Newark on April 13th. Booker has been described as a liberal. Throughout his Senate career, Booker has amassed a liberal voting record. In a July 2013 Salon interview, Booker said that "There's nothing in that realm of progressive politics where you won't find me." In a September 2013 interview with the Grio, when asked if he considered himself a progressive, he stated that he is a Democrat and an American. Booker has the most pro-animal welfare voting record in the Senate year after year, according to the Humane Society. He supports long-term deficit reduction efforts to ensure economic prosperity, cap and trade taxation to combat climate change, and increased funding for education. He has spoken in favour of creating a federal jobs guarantee and baby bonds, low-risk saving accounts that minors get access to at age 18. In the Senate, he has emphasised issues of racial and social justice. He played a leading role in the push to pass the First Step Act, a bipartisan criminal justice reform bill, bracket 138. He supports ending the war on drugs. Booker supports abortion rights and affirmative action. He also supports a single-payer health care plan. In September 2017, he joined Bernie Sanders and 14 other co-sponsors in submitting a single-payer health care plan to Congress called the Medicare for All bill. On foreign policy, Booker supports scaling down US involvement in Afghanistan and is against intervention in Syria. After the US strike on Syria in April 2017, he criticised military action without a clear plan or authorization from Congress. He supports a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestine conflict. On Iran, Booker has stated the country poses a direct threat to American and Israeli security and feels all options should be on the table for dealing with the conflict. However, his decision to back an Iran nuclear deal framework damaged his long-term relationship with Jewish voters and supporters. In an attempt to reduce the damage, he initiated an emergency summit for Jewish leaders, which some of his long-standing supporters did not attend. At a town hall meeting in Holyoke, Massachusetts on September the 29th, 2018, Elizabeth Warren said she would take a hard look at running for president in the 2020 election after the conclusion of the 2018 United States elections. On December the 31st, 2018, Warren announced that she was forming an exploratory committee to run for president. On February the 8th, 2019, Warren officially announced her candidacy at a rally in Lawrence, Massachusetts, at the site of the 1912 Bread and Roses strike. She staged her first campaign event in Lawrence, a former industrial mill town famous for that strike, to demonstrate the constituency groups she hopes to appeal to, including working-class families, union members, women and new immigrants. Warren is calling for major governmental changes. It won't be enough to just undo the terrible acts of this administration. We can't afford to just tinker around the edges. A tax credit here, a regulation there. Our fight is for big structural change. This is the fight of our lives. The fight to build an America where dreams are possible, an America that works for everyone. A long-time critic of President Trump, at her opening rally, Warren called him a symptom of a larger problem that has resulted in a rigged system that props up the rich and powerful and kicks dirt on everyone else. Since announcing her candidacy, Warren has released policy proposals, including plans to assist family farms by addressing the advantages held by large agricultural conglomerates, plans to reduce student loan debt and offer free tuition at public colleges, a plan to make large corporations pay more in taxes and better regulate large technology companies, and plans to address opioid addiction. She has introduced an economic patriotism plan intended to create opportunities for American workers and proposals targeted at Donald Trump, including one that would make it permissible to indict a sitting president. In early June, Warren placed second in some polls, with Joe Biden in the lead. Swalwell announced his candidacy on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert on April the 8th, 2019. He also released a campaign ad announcing his campaign on his social media pages. Swalwell has stated that gun control will be the primary focus of his campaign. He made a formal announcement at Dublin High School on April the 14th, 2019. Swalwell participated in one presidential debate. During the debate, he commented that he was 6 when Joe Biden spoke of passing the torch to a younger generation. On July the 8th, 2019, Swalwell withdrew from the race for the Democratic nomination. At the time, Swalwell was at risk for not qualifying for the second set of debates. Swalwell has advocated the repeal of the No Child Left Behind Act and increasing funding for education, while decreasing funding for defence. He has also advocated for renewable energy jobs to be created with federal stimulus money. He has stated he would attempt to raise the cap on the Social Security payroll tax, which currently applies to annual earnings only up to $110,000 as of 2012, so that wealthier Americans would pay more into the program. He has proposed the idea of a mobile Congress, with members casting votes remotely, while spending more time in their districts. In March 2013, Swalwell led in the writing of an open letter to John S. Pistole, Administrator of the Transportation Security Administration, TSA, opposing the new policy which would allow passengers to bring knives on board airplanes. He is a strong supporter of marriage equality for same-sex couples and is staunchly pro-choice. Throughout 2018, speculation rose that Inslee was considering a run for President of the United States in the 2020 election. He garnered national attention because of Washington versus Trump, a lawsuit challenging the Trump administration's order to ban entry from 7 Muslim-majority countries. While serving as chair of the Democratic Governors Association during the 2018 gubernatorial elections, he oversaw Democrats gaining 7 net governorships nationwide, further propelling him into the national spotlight and fueling speculation that he would run. Inslee cited climate change as his primary motivation for running, strongly criticising the Trump administration's policies. On January 2, 2019, it was reported that Inslee was beginning to form an exploratory committee, the first step in a campaign. Inslee would be a dark horse candidate. He has rarely been included in polling for the primary, is still not well known outside Washington, and has made few trips to early primary states such as Iowa and New Hampshire. But Inslee has pointed to former presidents Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton, calling them pretty much unknown governors of small states, and adding, "This is a wide open field. No one has a lock on this. No one has a total crystal ball as to what the nation wants." On February 22, 2019, it was reported that Inslee would formally launch his presidential campaign on March 1. On March 1, 2019, Inslee announced his presidential campaign bid, stating his main campaign focus would be combating climate change. Inslee's campaign requested a debate specifically focused on climate change. The DNC denied the request, but 53 of its voting members wrote an open letter protesting that decision. On March 4, 2019, John Hickenlooper announced his campaign to seek the Democratic nomination for President of the United States in 2020. Since 2003, Hickenlooper has campaigned for increasing services to the homeless. As Denver mayor, he announced a 10-year plan to end homelessness in the U.S. Conference of Mayors in Washington, D.C. Cities across the country, including Chicago, Philadelphia, New York and Atlanta, made similar plans. Hickenlooper's Denver Commission on Homelessness included members from public agencies, non-profits, businesses and the faith community. In 2000, Colorado voters passed Initiative 20, which legalized marijuana for medical use. In 2006, Denver became one of the first major U.S. cities to legalize the medical use of and decriminalize possession of less than 1 ounce of cannabis by those over age 18. Hickenlooper, then a co-owner of the Wynkoop Brewing Company, opposed the cannabis rescheduling initiative, which voters approved 53.49% to 46.51%, but did say that the vote reflects a genuine shift in people's attitudes. The Denver police interpretation of the law, supported by Hickenlooper, was that it did not usurp Colorado Revised Statutes, CRS. In 2012, Amendment 64 was added to the Colorado Constitution, allowing possession of up to 1 ounce of cannabis for those over 21 for recreational use. Though Hickenlooper had been publicly against this policy as well, he said he would enforce the will of the people. On January 23, 2015, he said that this was a bad idea, that other governors should wait and see what the consequences will be. As Colorado's new laws have been implemented and the results became more clear, Hickenlooper has indicated that his views have evolved, stating in May 2016 that Colorado's approach to cannabis legalization is beginning to look like it might work. On March 20, 2013, Hickenlooper signed bills HB 1224, HB 1228 and HB 1229. HB 1224 created a limit of 15 rounds in magazines that could be bought, sold, or transferred within the state. HB 1229 requires background checks for any firearm transfer within the state, and HB 1228 taxes firearm transfers to recover costs of the background checks from HB 1229. Opponents of these bills gathered enough signatures to trigger special recall elections that resulted in the recall of Democratic Senate President John Morse and Democratic Senator Angela Giron. Democratic Senator Evie Huddock later resigned rather than face her own recall election on this issue. Hickenlooper is a member of the gun control group Mayors Against Illegal Guns, an organisation formed in 2006 and co-chaired by former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg and former Boston Mayor Thomas Menino. In 2018, Hickenlooper supported a red flag or extreme risk protection order bill in the legislature that would have allowed judges to temporarily restrict firearm access to those who were deemed a significant risk to themselves or others. The GOP-controlled state Senate never let the bill out of committee that legislative season. On May 22, 2013, Hickenlooper granted an indefinite stay of execution to Nathan Dunlap, who was facing execution for the 1993 murder of 4 employees at a Chuck E. Cheese restaurant. The decision came after victims' families asked Hickenlooper to allow the execution of Dunlap to proceed as scheduled. Hickenlooper stated, "It is a legitimate question whether we as a state should be taking lives." In Hickenlooper's 2016 memoir, he came out against the death penalty. He explained that his views on the death penalty changed after becoming more familiarized with the research showing bias against minorities and people with mental illnesses. In 2011, Hickenlooper signed SB 11-200, which had passed through the Republican-held State House to create Colorado's healthcare exchange. In 2013, Hickenlooper signed SB 13-200 to expand Medicaid as part of the Affordable Care Act. After these changes, Colorado's insured rate rose to 93.5%. He opposes Medicare for all, citing research that more than 100 million Americans are satisfied with their current employer-provided insurance plan, and saying it would make no sense to force them into a new program that costs trillions to implement. Hickenlooper signed legislation to provide better disaster relief to Coloradans after record-setting floods and wildfires had ravaged the state and destroyed homes, schools, roads and watersheds. The bills distributed $5 billion in grants to remove flood debris from watersheds, earmarked construction funding for flood-damaged schools, and budgeted $17 million in grants for repairs to damaged wastewater and drinking water systems. One of the bills called for the state to pay the property taxes of people who lost homes in Colorado floods or wildfires, which accounted for about 2,500 destroyed or damaged homes. Hickenlooper's administration created the first methane capture regulations for oil and gas companies in the entire country. The rules prevented 95% of volatile organic compounds and methane from leaking from hydraulic fracturing wells. The rules were later used as blueprints for California, Canada, and the federal government's own new rules. After President Donald Trump announced that the United States would be leaving the Paris Climate Accord, Hickenlooper joined more than a dozen other states in sticking with the greenhouse gas emission reduction goals. Hickenlooper is a supporter of the oil and gas industry. In opposition to most Democrats, Hickenlooper supports hydraulic fracking, a deep oil drilling procedure and controversial political issue in Colorado. Before politics, Hickenlooper's first career was as a geologist. He believes fracking is a beneficial practice with minimal environmental harm. In a 2013 hearing before the Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources, Hickenlooper testified that he drank a glass of fracking fluid produced by Halliburton, claiming that because all of the ingredients had been sourced from the food industry, the fluid was safe for humans to drink. In March 2014, he signed House Bill 1241, which funds the Rural Economic Development Initiative, READY. The program has a total grant budget of $2.7 million, of which $530,000 has been awarded. Right now, 7 projects are under consideration, representing $20 million in capital investment and more than 150 new jobs in rural areas. In 2016, Hickenlooper launched a program called Skillful with the help of LinkedIn and the Markle Foundation. The program uses online tools and on-the-ground advisors to help businesses create job descriptions to tap into a wider job pool and help job seekers fill high-need jobs and connect them with job training. 20 other states are now following. In 2017, Skillful added the Governor's Coaching Corps program, a career coaching initiative operated out of Workforce Center, community colleges, and non-profits, with the help of a $25.8 million grant from Microsoft. In 2018, Colorado was ranked by US News as having the #1 economy in the country. Hickenlooper calls himself a fiscal conservative. He says, "I don't think the government needs to be bigger. I think the government's got to work, and people have got to believe in government, and I think that's part of the problem." He says, "I think what a lot of Americans want is better government, not bigger government." Julian Castro. On December 12, 2018, Julian Castro announced the formation of an exploratory committee. The next day, during an episode of The Late Show with Stephen Colbert, Julian's brother, Joaquin, during a joint appearance by both brothers, stated that he confidently believes that Julian will be running for president. Castro formally announced his candidacy for the 2020 presidential election on January 12, 2019. Castro would be the first Democratic presidential nominee since 1924 not to serve as vice president, governor, or senator. He is the first Texan in the 2020 race and would be third youngest president if elected. In his announcement, Castro emphasized Medicare for all, universal pre-K, and a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants as part of comprehensive immigration reform. Castro believes in balanced budgets and is a supporter of free trade. He has been a strong supporter of the North American Free Trade Agreement while serving as mayor of San Antonio, but has also said that the agreement should be renegotiated to strengthen worker and environmental protections. Castro has voiced support for making the first 2 years of higher education free. He supports universal pre-kindergarten and managed to institute a pre-kindergarten program for 4-year-olds, funded by higher local taxes, while serving as mayor of San Antonio. Castro has called for universal health care and Medicare for all, and indicated he would consider funding such a program by raising taxes on corporations and the wealthy. He has supported the Affordable Care Act. Castro supports the Paris Climate Accord and has criticized President Trump's withdrawal from the agreement. While in office, Castro worked with companies to promote their transition to renewable energy. He has voiced support for a Green New Deal. In the past, Castro has advocated for an energy policy that includes fossil fuels, while also pointing out the benefits of fossil fuel jobs. Castro has endorsed a gradual withdrawal of US troops from Syria, while also criticizing Trump's approach to the issue. Castro has stated that he is not going to take any PAC money as a presidential candidate and has encouraged others to do the same. He had, however, formed a PAC, Opportunity First, in 2017, which mostly covered his running expenses, while also donating to several dozen young progressive Democratic politicians. Despite his Catholic background, Castro is pro-choice and has vigorously opposed state laws limiting abortion access after the 20th week of pregnancy and other restrictions. Castro has been an advocate for LGBT rights and, as mayor, opposed the law in Texas, later overturned by the US Supreme Court, that denied legal recognition to same-sex marriages. He is also a member of Washington, D.C.-based think tank, the Inter-American Dialogue. Castro was the first San Antonio mayor to serve as the Grand Marshal of the city's Pride Parade in 2009, and in 2011 led a push to offer domestic partner benefits in the city. In 2012, he joined mayors across the country in signing the Mayors for the Freedom to Marry petition for same-sex marriage equality. Castro said in a tweet that transgender persons should be allowed to serve in the armed forces. In his remarks during the first round of 2019 Democratic presidential debates, Castro pledged to make abortions available to trans men, mistakenly referring to them as trans women. He later rectified himself to include all trans and non-binary people after having been corrected on Twitter. Castro supports tighter gun control and has supported the reinstatement of the assault weapons ban, limiting access to high-capacity magazines and closing the gun show loophole. Castro has backed affirmative action. Castro supports a pathway to citizenship for most undocumented residents of the US, has opposed President Trump's border wall plan, and has said that the US Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency needs to be reconstituted. Additionally, he asserted in the first Democratic primary candidate debates on June 26, 2019, that he would repeal Section 1325 of Title 8 of the US Criminal Code, which would decriminalize illegal entry into the US, rendering unlawful entry a civil offence instead of a criminal one. Carmela Harris had been considered a top contender and potential frontrunner for the 2020 Democratic nomination for president. In June 2018, she was quoted as not ruling it out. As of July 2018, she was spending more on Facebook advertising than any other senator. In July 2018, it was announced that she would publish a memoir, another sign of a possible run. She also stumped for candidates in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and South Carolina. On January 21, 2019, Harris officially announced her candidacy for President of the United States in the 2020 United States presidential election. During the first 24 hours following her candidacy announcement, she tied a record set by Bernie Sanders in 2016 for the most money raised in the day following announcement. However, Sanders later broke this record after announcing his 2020 presidential campaign. Over 20,000 people attended her formal campaign launch event in her hometown of Oakland, California on January 27th. According to a police estimate. Harris's support rose by between 6 and 9 points in polls following the first Democratic presidential debate. Since her election to the Senate, Harris has maintained a 100% rating by the abortion rights advocacy group Planned Parenthood Action Fund and a 0% rating by the anti-abortion group National Right to Life Committee. Harris's 2020 campaign has disavowed most corporate donations and has committed to rejecting money from corporate political action committees for her presidential campaign. Harris, along with candidates Cory Booker, Julian Castro, Tulsi Gabbard, Kirsten Gillibrand, Amy Klobuchar, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and Marianne Williamson, has explicitly discouraged single-candidate super PACs from operating on her behalf, though she cannot prevent them from doing so. In 2017, Harris met with prominent Democratic Party donors in the Hamptons. In 2019, Hollywood celebrities, including J.J. Abrams, hosted a big fundraiser for her. For her 2020 campaign, Harris is relying on both small and large individual donors. After the FEC released donation disclosures in April 2019, The Intercept noted that the Harris campaign received the most registered lobbyists' donations of any Democratic presidential campaign that has said it would not take the cash. Harris did not initially support the legalization of recreational marijuana, but later moved to support legalization. In 2010, while campaigning for Attorney General of California, she opposed Proposition 19, the first failed attempt to legalize recreational marijuana in California, on the grounds that selling drugs harm communities. In 2015, she called for an end on the federal prohibition of medical marijuana. In May 2018, Harris announced she would co-sponsor the Marijuana Justice Act, which Senator Cory Booker introduced in August 2017. The legislation would eliminate marijuana's status as a Schedule I drug under the Controlled Substance Act. The move would also require federal courts to automatically expunge earlier federal marijuana convictions related to use or possession, and would establish a grant program aimed at incentivizing the expungement and sealing of state convictions for marijuana possession. Harris is opposed to the death penalty, but has said she would review each case individually. Her position was questioned in April 2004 when SFPD officer Isaac Espinoza was murdered in the Bayview district. She announced that she would not seek the death penalty for the man accused of his killing. The decision evoked protests from the San Francisco Police Officers Association, Senator Dianne Feinstein, and others. Those who supported her decision not to seek the death penalty included San Francisco supervisors Tom Amiano and Sophie Maxwell, in whose district the murder occurred. The jury found the convicted killer, David Hill, guilty of second-degree murder, although the prosecutor, Harry Dorfman, had sought a first-degree murder conviction. The defense had argued that Hill thought Espinoza was a member of a rival gang and that the murder was not premeditated. Hill was given the maximum sentence for the conviction, life without the possibility of parole. Harris's position against the death penalty was tested again in the case of Edwin Ramos, an illegal immigrant and alleged MS-13 gang member, who was accused of murdering Tony Bologna and his sons Michael and Matthew. On September 10, 2009, she announced she would seek life in prison without the possibility of parole rather than the death penalty in the Ramos case. Harris has expressed the belief that life without possibility of parole is a better and more cost-effective punishment. According to the California Commission on the Fair Administration of Justice, the death penalty costs $137 million per year. If the system were changed to life without possibility of parole, the annual costs would be approximately $12 million per year. She noted that the resulting surplus could put 1,000 more police officers into service in San Francisco alone. When in 2014, U.S. District Judge Cormac J. Carney declared capital punishment in California unconstitutional, Harris appealed the case. In August 2018, Harris was one of 8 senators to sign a letter to the Federal Emergency Management Agency charging the agency with not assisting displaced homeowners in Puerto Rico in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria under the Individuals and Households Program, IHP, at alarming rates. Harris has argued for treating habitual and chronic truancy among children in elementary school as a crime committed by the parents of truant children. She argues that there is a direct connection between habitual truancy in elementary school and crime later in life. She has received the endorsement of the California Federation of Teachers. Harris opposed California's ban on affirmative action. She asked the Supreme Court to reaffirm its decision that public colleges and universities may consider race as one factor in admissions decisions. Harris filed legal papers in the Supreme Court case supporting race as an admissions factor at the University of Texas. She also filed papers supporting affirmative action in a different Supreme Court case involving the University of Michigan. Harris supports busing for desegregation of public schools, saying that the schools of America are as segregated, if not more segregated today, as I was in elementary school. Harris views busing as an option to be considered by school districts rather than the responsibility of the federal government. On December 21, 2017, Harris was one of 6 senators to introduce the Secure Elections Act, legislation authorizing block grants for states that would update outdated voting technology. The Act would also create a program for an independent panel of experts to develop cybersecurity guidelines for election systems that states could adopt if they choose, along with offering states resources to implement the recommendations. During her time as San Francisco District Attorney, Harris created the Environmental Justice Unit in the San Francisco District Attorney's Office and prosecuted several industries and individuals for pollution, most notably U-Haul, Alameda Publishing Corporation, and the Costco-Busan oil spill. She also advocated for strong enforcement of environmental protection laws. In October 2017, Harris was one of 19 senators to sign a letter to the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, Scott Pruitt, questioning Pruitt's decision to repeal the Clean Power Plan, asserting that the repeal's proposal used mathematical sleights of hand to overstate the costs of industry compliance with the 2015 rule and understate the benefits that will be lost if the 2017 repeal is finalized. And science denying and math fabricating would fail to satisfy the requirements of the law, nor will it slow the increase in frequency and intensity of extreme weather events, the inexorable rise in sea levels, or the other dire effects of global warming that our planet is already experiencing. In September 2018, Harris was one of 8 senators to sponsor the Climate Risk Disclosure Act, described by co-sponsor Elizabeth Warren as using market forces to speed up the transition from fossil fuels to cleaner energy, reducing the odds of an environmental and financial disaster without spending a dime of taxpayer money. She stated that her goal would be achieving 100% of US electricity from renewable energy sources, and that she supports a Green New Deal, an idea made popular by first-term Congresswoman Alexandria Cortez, because climate change is an existential threat to all of us. In November 2018, Harris was one of 25 Democratic senators to co-sponsor a resolution specifying key findings of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report and National Climate Assessment. The resolution affirmed the senators' acceptance of the findings and their support for bold action toward addressing climate change. In April 2017, responding to the Khan Shaykhun chemical attack, Harris charged Syrian President Bashar al-Assad with attacking Syrian children and stated the clear fact that President Assad is not only a ruthless dictator brutalizing his own people, he is a war criminal the international community cannot ignore. She called on President Trump to work with Congress on his administration's lack of clear objectives in Syria and articulate a detailed strategy and path forward in partnership with our allies. In 2017, Harris gave a public address to AIPAC attendees. She said, "I believe Israel should never be a partisan issue, and as long as I am a United States Senator, I will do everything in my power to ensure broad and bipartisan support for Israel's security and right to self-defense." She has opposed the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement targeting Israel. She was a co-sponsor of a Senate resolution expressing objection to the UN Security Council Resolution 2334, which condemned Israeli settlement building in the occupied Palestine territories as a violation of international law. At the AIPAC conference, she said that the first resolution I co-sponsored as a United States Senator was to combat anti-Israel bias at the United Nations. She also supported a Senate resolution celebrating the 50th anniversary of the reunification of Jerusalem. In late 2017, she travelled to Israel, where she met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. In October 2017, Harris condemned the genocide of the Rohingya Muslim minority in Myanmar and called for a stronger response to the crisis. In February 2018, Harris was one of 18 Democratic senators to sign a letter to Trump stating that he lacked the authority to launch a preemptive strike against North Korea without authorization from Congress. The letter stated, "Without congressional authority, a preventative or preemptive U.S. military strike would lack either a constitutional basis or legal authority." In 2018, after Trump announced the United States was withdrawing from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, Harris released a statement saying the decision jeopardizes our national security and isolates us from our closest allies, while calling the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action the best existing tool we have to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons and avoid a disastrous military conflict in the Middle East. In late 2018, she voted to withdraw US military aid for Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen. She also backed a resolution blaming Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman for the murder of dissident journalist Kamal Khashoggi in the Saudi Arabian consulate in Istanbul. Harris supported the Iran nuclear deal to prevent Iran from acquiring weapons of mass destruction. In December 2018, after Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced the Trump administration was suspending its obligations in the Immediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in 60 days, in the event that Russia continued to violate the treaty, she was one of 26 senators to sign a letter expressing concern over the administration now abandoning generations of bipartisan US leadership around the paired goals of reducing the global role and number of nuclear weapons and ensuring strategic stability with America's nuclear-armed adversaries, and calling on Trump to continue arms negotiations. Harris voted in favour of a $675 billion defence budget for the 2019. She said that North Korea is one of the most serious security threats. In February 2019, after former acting FBI Director Andrew McCabe claimed that President Trump believed the claims of President of Russia Vladimir Putin over US intelligence agencies' reports on the subject of North Korea's missile capabilities, she told reporters, "The idea that the President of the US would take the word of the head of Russia over the intel community is the height of irresponsibility and shameful." Harris earned an F rating from the National Rifle Association for her consistent efforts supporting gun control. While serving as district attorney in San Francisco, Harris, along with other district attorneys, filed an amicus brief in District of Columbia versus Heller, arguing that the Washington, D.C. gun law at issue did not violate the Second Amendment. In her second term as district attorney, she said that getting guns off the street was a priority. During her run for Senate, Harris was endorsed by former U.S. Representative Gabby Giffords, shot in Tucson in 2011. She was also endorsed by the Brady Campaign to Prevent Gun Violence. In response to the 2017 Las Vegas shooting, Harris supported the call for more gun control, saying that she believed that thoughts and prayers were inadequate answers to the shooting. She stated that, "We must also commit ourselves to action. Another moment of silence won't suffice." Harris owns a gun for personal safety, as she was a career prosecutor. On August 30th, 2017, Harris announced at a town hall in Oakland that she would co-sponsor fellow Senator Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All bill, supporting single-payer health care. In April 2018, Harris was one of 10 senators to sponsor the Choose Medicare Act, an expanded public option for health insurance that also increased Obamacare subsidiaries and rendered individuals with higher income levels eligible for its assistance. In December 2018, Harris was one of 42 senators to sign a letter to Trump administration officials Alex Azar, Seema Verma and Steve Mnuchin, arguing that the administration was improperly using Section 1332 of the Affordable Care Act to authorize states to increase healthcare costs for millions of consumers while weakening protections for individuals with pre-existing conditions. The senators requested the administration withdraw the policy and re-engage with stakeholders, states and Congress. Harris has expressed support for San Francisco's sanctuary city policy of not inquiring about immigration status in the process of a criminal investigation. She argued that it is important that immigrants be able to talk with law enforcement without fear. On October 25, 2017, Harris stated she would not support a spending bill until Congress addressed the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program in a way that clarified what we are going to do to protect and take care of our darker young people in this country. She did not support a February 2018 proposal by some Democrats to provide President Trump with a $25 billion in funding for a border wall in exchange for giving Dreamers a pathway to citizenship. In a January 2018, when asked by Hiram Soto about her ideal version of a bipartisan deal on the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, Harris stated the need to focus on comprehensive immigration reform and pass a Clean Dream Act. In April 2018, Harris was one of 5 senators to send a letter to Acting Director of ICE, Thomas Homan, on standards used by the agency when determining how to detain a pregnant woman, requesting that pregnant women not be held in custody unless under extraordinary standards after reports that ICE had failed to provide critical medical care to pregnant women in immigration detention, resulting in miscarriages and other negative health outcomes. In July 2018, the Trump administration falsely accused Harris of supporting the animals of MS-13. She responded, "As a career prosecutor, I actually went after gangs and transnational criminal organizations. That's being a leader on public safety. What is not is ripping babies from their mothers." In July 2018, Harris was one of 22 senators to sponsor the Stop Shackling and Detaining Pregnant Women Act, which, if enacted, would prohibit immigration officers for detaining pregnant women in a majority of circumstances and improve conditions of care for individuals in custody. In August 2018, Harris led 15 Democrats and Bernie Sanders in a letter to United States Secretary of Homeland Security, Kirstjen Nielsen, demanding that the Trump administration take immediate action in attempting to reunite 539 migrant children with their families, citing each passing day of inaction as intensifying trauma that this administration has needlessly caused for children and their families seeking humanitarian protection. In November 2018, Harris was one of 11 senators to sign a letter to United States Secretary of Defense James Mattis concerning the overt politicization of the military, with the Trump administration's deployment of 5,800 troops to the U.S.-Mexico border, and requesting a briefing and written justification from the U.S. Northern Command for troop deployment, while urging Mattis to curb the unprecedented escalation of DoD involvement in immigration enforcement. In January 2019, Harris was one of 20 senators to sponsor the Dreamer Confidentiality Act, a bill imposing a ban on the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, from passing information collected on DACA recipients to Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, Customs and Border Protection, CBP, the Department of Justice, or any other law enforcement agency, with exceptions in the case of fraudulent claims, national security issues, or non-immigration related felonies being investigated. In June 2019, following the Housing and Urban Development Department's confirmation that DACA recipients did not meet eligibility for federal-backed loans, Harris and 11 other senators introduced the Home Ownership Dreamers Act. legislation that mandated that the federal government was not authorised to deny mortgage loans backed by the Federal Housing Administration, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, or the Agriculture Department solely due to the immigration status of an applicant. In July 2019, along with Kirsten Gillibrand and Amy Klobuchar, Harris sent a letter to the Office of Refugee Resettlement asserting that the agency should be prioritising reunification of every child as soon as possible, but instead it has been responsible for policies that are forcing longer stays in government custody for children, and that it was mandatory that the office ensure that the custody and processing of unaccompanied migrant children is meeting the minimum standards required by domestic and international law. In July 2019, Harris and 15 other Senate Democrats introduced the Protecting Sensitive Locations Act, which mandated that ICE agents get approval from a supervisor ahead of engaging in enforcement actions at sensitive locations, with the exception of special circumstances, and that agents receive annual training in addition to being required to report annually regarding enforcement actions in those locations. During her tenure as California Attorney General, Harris declined to defend the state's ban on same-sex marriage in court. She supported the Obama administration's guidance supporting transgender students. Following the Supreme Court's overturning of the ban on same-sex marriage, she proceeded to conduct California's first same-sex marriage. Later on, in 2015, she argued in court to withhold gender reassignment surgery from 2 transgender inmates who were prescribed the procedure while serving the sentences. This stance disappointed some LGBT rights advocates. She later stated that she only took that stance in court because her job required her to do so. As a member of the US Senate, she co-sponsored the Equality Act. In September 2017, Harris was one of 9 senators to sign a letter to Federal Communications Commission Chairman Ajit Pai that charged the FCC with failing to provide stakeholders with an opportunity to comment on the tens of thousands of filed complaints that directly shed light on proposed changes to existing net neutrality protections. In March 2018, Harris was one of 10 senators to sign a letter spearheaded by Jeff Merkley, lambasting a proposal from FCC Chairman Ajit Pai that would curb the scope of benefits from the Lifeline program during a period where roughly 6.5 million people in poor communities relied on Lifeline to receive access to high-speed internet, citing that it was Pai's obligation to the American public as the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission to improve the Lifeline program and ensure that more Americans can afford access and have means of access to broadband and phone service. The senators also advocated for ensuring Lifeline reaches more Americans in need of access to communication services. Harris is opposed to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 and has called for a repeal of the bill's tax cuts for wealthy Americans. In 2018, she proposed a tax cut for the majority of working and middle-class Americans. An analysis by the Non-Partisan Tax Policy Center estimated that the bill would reduce federal revenue by $2.8 trillion over a decade. She proposed to pay for the tax cuts by repealing tax cuts for wealthy Americans and by increasing taxes on corporations. In May 2019, Harris attributed the 2018 gubernatorial losses of Stacey Abrams and Andrew Gillum in both Georgia and Florida to voter suppression. Gillibrand has been mentioned as a possible Democratic nominee for president in 2020, but when asked about the race in May 2017, she said she was ruling it out. Gillibrand announced on January 15, 2019, that she was launching a presidential exploratory committee. In an interview with Stephen Colbin, she said, "I am going to run." Gillibrand released a March 17, 2019 video officially announcing her 2020 presidential bid. Following a common trend that has arisen among Democratic politicians, Gillibrand pledged that she would not accept campaign donations from political action committees or PACs. During her tenure in the House of Representatives, Gillibrand was known as a centrist Democrat. While serving in the House, Gillibrand was a member of the Blue Dog Coalition, a caucus of fiscally conservative Democrats. During her House tenure, Gillibrand voted against the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act of 2008, spoke against the issuance of driver's licenses to undocumented immigrants, and voted for a bill that would withhold federal funds from immigrant sanctuary cities. Gillibrand also voted for a bill that limited information sharing between federal agencies about firearm purchases and advocated for civil unions for same-sex couples. Since she became a member of the US Senate, Gillibrand's political positions have moved in a liberal direction. In July 2018, Newsday stated that Gillibrand formerly held more conservative views on guns and immigration, but in her 9 years as New York's junior senator has swung steadily to the left on those and other issues. After being appointed to the US Senate, she expressed support for same-sex marriage. Although a supporter of gun rights while in the House, Gillibrand has since moved in the direction of gun control. Gillibrand has said that a conversation with a family who had lost a daughter to gun violence made her realise that she was wrong to oppose gun control measures. Having once received an A rating from the NRA, she received an F rating as of 2018. In June 2018, Gillibrand called US Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, a deportation force, and became the first sitting senator to support the call to abolish ICE. She said, "I believe you should get rid of it, start over, reimagine it, and build something that actually works. And I think you should reimagine ICE under a new agency with a very different mission." In May 2018, City and State reported that she had moved sharply leftward on economic issues, embracing a number of proposals to expand the social safety net and bolster lower-income families. In July 2018, the New York Times stated that Gillibrand had spent recent months injecting her portfolio with a dose of the kind of economic populism that infused Senator Bernie Sanders' campaign in the 2016 presidential primary. In a 2019 reversal of a past position, Gillibrand stated her support for driver's licenses for undocumented immigrants. On social issues, Gillibrand is generally liberal, supporting abortion rights and helping lead the successful repeal effort of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. A supporter of Medicare for All since her first House run in 2006, she co-sponsored a 2017 Medicare for All bill introduced by Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont and said that healthcare should be a right. Gillibrand also supports a federal jobs guarantee. Although she used to be one of the top recipients of corporate campaign donations, in 2018 Gillibrand supported rejecting corporate PAC funds and invested heavily in online fundraising. 78% of donations to her 2018 campaign totaled $100 or less. She advocates government transparency, being one of a few members of Congress who release much personal and scheduling information. Gillibrand has gone against her party on a number of occasions on issues related to women's rights. Declaring a zero-tolerance doctrine regarding accusations of sexual misconduct by members of Congress, Gillibrand was the first in her caucus to call on Senator Al Franken, DMD, to resign. Franken left office before a state ethics committee investigation could review the accuracy of the allegations. In November 2017, amid the Me Too movement, Gillibrand became the first high-profile Democrat to say that Bill Clinton should have resigned when his affair with Monica Lewinsky was revealed. In 2018, Clinton expressed disagreement with Gillibrand's opinion. Gillibrand was also criticised for retaining a male staffer, despite multiple sexual harassment complaints by a former female aide. This contrasted with her unyielding stand against sexual misconduct by other men like Al Franken. The male staffer was fired immediately after Politico published the allegations. On November 15, 2018, Marianne Williamson announced the formation of a presidential exploratory committee in a video in which she acclaimed, "There was a miracle in this country in 1776, and we need another one," which would require a co-creative effort, an effort of love and a gift of love to our country and hopefully to our world. Visiting New Hampshire in early January, she said that she received enough positive energy to make me feel I should take the next step, and subsequently hired Brent Rosk to lead her operation in Iowa. Rosk, a film producer who also contested the same 2014 primary for the seat, now represented by Ted Lieu, maintained a wide network of connections in Iowa, due in part to his previous involvement in the state, working on a political television show about the 2016 caucuses. In response to the Iowa Democratic Party's proposed creation of virtual caucuses in the 2020 race, Williamson's campaign announced that it would appoint 99 virtual Iowa caucus captains, each assigned to a single county, to turn out supporters in both the virtual and in-person caucuses. Williamson officially launched her presidential campaign in Los Angeles on January 28, 2019, in front of an audience of 20,000 attendees, and appointed Morris Daniel, who served alongside Donna Brazile in Dick Gephardt's campaign for the Democratic nomination in 1988, as her national campaign manager, with her campaign committee, Marianne Williamson for President, officially filed on February 4th. Following her Los Angeles announcement, she held her Iowa kickoff in Des Moines on January 31st. On February 16th, in addition to scheduling another trip to New Hampshire, Williamson's campaign announced the appointment of former Congressman Paul Hodes, who represented New Hampshire's 2nd Congressional District from 2007 to 2011, as New Hampshire State Director and Senior Campaign Advisor. Former Georgia State Assemblywoman Gloria Brommel-Tinubu, who returned to South Carolina in 2011 to run for Congress in the state's 7th District, and later joined Phil Noble's bid for governor in 2018 as his running mate, served as South Carolina State Director and National Senior Advisor to the Williamson campaign, but later ceased working with the campaign. On May 9th, Williamson's campaign announced that she had received enough contributions from unique donors to enter the official primary debates, having raised $1.5 million in the first quarter of 2019, during which the campaign received donations from 46,663 unique individuals. She subsequently met the polling criteria, with 3 unique polls at 1% from qualifying pollsters, on May 23rd. In June, Williamson confirmed that she moved to Des Moines, Iowa, in advance of the 2020 caucuses. Williamson claims to be a pretty straight-line progressive Democrat, supporting an increase of the federal minimum wage to $15 per hour, reducing income inequality, addressing climate change, and tackling student loan debt. She backs a Medicare for All model, deferred action for childhood arrivals, DACA, and a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants without a serious criminal background, and says that the US needs to be an honest broker in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. She ranks climate change as the greatest moral challenge of our generation and backs the Green New Deal. She has called for the establishment of a Department of Peace to expand global diplomacy, mediation, and educational and economic development. She also voices support for stricter gun control, criminal justice reform, improving public education, free college tuition, raising the top marginal tax rate to a point where high earners pay their fair share of taxes, describes her policies as a renovation of a sociopathic economic system focused on short-term profit maximization. She has described mandatory vaccinations as Orwellian, stating, "To me, it's no different than the abortion debate." She later stated that she misspoke and, "I support vaccines. Public safety must be carefully balanced with the right of individuals to make their own decisions." According to the Los Angeles Times, she has a history of skeptical comments about vaccinations. Her signature campaign promise is a call for $100 billion in repatriations for slavery to be distributed over 10 years by a group of black leaders for selected economic and education projects, and later suggested distributing $200 to $500 billion on the Breakfast Club, a sum far greater than any other primary contender's support. In doing so, Williamson became the only candidate in the Democratic field to submit a detailed plan for reparations for black Americans, though fellow Democratic presidential candidates Elizabeth Warren and Carmela Harris later pledged support for reparations in late February 2019, and Mike Gravel has also expressed his support for a national reparations trust fund. Michael Bennett has been mentioned as a possible presidential candidate following his viral response to Senator Ted Cruz in January 2019. In February and March 2019, he travelled to early primary states such as Iowa and New Hampshire. In late March, Bennett said he was very inclined to run for the presidency. On May the 2nd, he officially declared his intention to run for president during an appearance on CBS's This Morning. In March 2019, Bennett was one of 38 senators to sign a letter to United States Secretary of Agriculture, Sonny Perdue, warning that dairy farmers have continued to face market instability and are struggling to survive the fourth year of sustained low prices, and urging his department to strongly encourage these farmers to consider the Dairy Margin Coverage Program. As of 2010, Bennett had earned a C+ rating from the National Rifle Association for a mixed record regarding his votes for gun rights. In 2012, Bennett joined then Colorado Senator Mark Udall in asking for stricter gun control in response to the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting. After the shooting, Bennett said, "In Colorado, we support the Second Amendment right to bear arms. We support the ability of people to hunt and recreate and to protect their families and homes, and we want to keep the wrong weapons out of the hands of the wrong people." Bennett participated in the Chris Murphy gun control filibuster, demanding that gun laws be changed in the wake of the Orlando nightclub shooting. During his participation in the filibuster, Bennett talked about the 2012 Aurora shooting, citing that as a response to the shooting, the state of Colorado closed gun sale loopholes and now requires background checks for any gun purchase. In response to the 2017 Las Vegas shooting, Bennett demanded universal background checks regarding gun sales and described the shooting as domestic terrorism. In 2013, Bennett voted against a Senate Amendment 711 to S649, the Safe Communities, Safe Schools Act of 2013, an amendment introduced by Senator Dianne Feinstein that would have reinstated the federal assault weapons ban. The amendment was defeated 40-60, with one Republican, Mark Kirk, voting in favour, and 16 Democrats, including independent Senator Angus King, who caucuses with Democrats, against. Also in 2013, Bennett voted to strengthen the background check system and to ban high-capacity magazines. Bennett owns a shotgun, which he has called a hunting shotgun. Bennett supports same-sex marriage. He lauded the Supreme Court's 2015 decision in Obergefell v. Hodges that legalized same-sex marriage nationwide, stating on his Senate website, "Marriage is a fundamental right that same-sex couples deserve to enjoy, and now they will have the same rights and opportunities that the law grants to Susan, Bennett's spouse, and me. Bennett is the author of legislation to direct resources to improve the sexual health of older Americans, including LGBTQ+ and rural senior populations. He is an original co-sponsor of the Equality Act. Bennett voted in support of the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act signed by President Barack Obama on March 23, 2010. In November 2009, when the bill was still working its way through Congress, Bennett said that he would support healthcare reform even if it meant losing the election. In 2016, in response to Western and Central Colorado having some of the highest healthcare costs in the United States, Bennett said he didn't have answers and called it next to impossible to fix the Affordable Care Act, given partisan attitudes at that time. As part of a group of Democrats proposing more incremental steps to broaden healthcare coverage, as opposed to Bernie Sanders' push for Medicare for all, Bennett and Senator Tim Kaine have proposed Medicare X. Medicare X would create a public option modelled after Medicare alongside private options on the Obamacare marketplaces. In 2019, Bennett and Kaine reintroduced the latest version of the plan, which would also expand access to tax credits. In January 2019, during the 2018-19 United States federal government shutdown, Bennett was one of 34 senators to sign a letter to Commissioner of Food and Drugs, Scott Gottlieb, recognizing the efforts of the FDA to address the shutdown's effect on public health and employees, while remaining alarmed that the continued shutdown will result in increasingly harmful effects on the agency's employees and the safety and security of the nation's food and medical products. In April 2019, Bennett and Senator Chuck Grassley's Advancing Care for Exceptional ACE Kids Act legislation that creates an option for states and families to provide improved coordination of care for children with complex medical conditions was signed into law. In September 2009, Bennett co-sponsored the DREAM Act, which proposed amending the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of 1996 by giving residency to immigrants enrolled in higher education programs or serving in the military. In 2013, he was a member of the Gang of Eight, a bipartisan group of 4 Democratic and 4 Republican U.S. senators who introduced comprehensive immigration reform legislation. Their bill, the Border Security, Economic Opportunity and Immigration Modernization Act of 2013, passed the U.S. Senate with a vote of 68 to 32, but stalled in the House due to opposition from the Republican majority. He later co-sponsored the DREAM Act of 2017. After President Trump ended the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals (DACA) program, Bennett worked with a bipartisan group of senators to provide a pathway to citizenship for Dreamers with stronger border protections. In August 2018, Bennett was one of 17 senators to sign a letter spearheaded by Carmela Harris to United States Secretary of Homeland Security, Kirstjen Nielsen, demanding that the Trump administration take immediate action in attempting to reunite 539 migrant children with their families, citing each passing day of inaction as intensifying trauma that this administration has needlessly caused for children and their families seeking humanitarian protection. In June 2019, Bennett and 6 other Democratic senators, led by Hawaii Senator Brian Schatz, sent letters to the Government Accountability Office and the suspension and debarment official and Inspector General at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, citing recent reports that showed significant evidence that some federal contractors and grantees have not provided adequate accommodations for children in line with legal and contractual requirements, and urged the officials to determine whether federal contractors and grantees are in violation of contractual obligations or federal regulations, and should thus face financial consequences. In July 2019, following reports that the Trump administration intended to cease protecting spouses, parents and children of active duty service members from deportation, Bennett was one of 22 senators, led by Tammy Duckworth, to sign a letter arguing that the protection gave service members the ability to fight for the United States overseas and not worry that their spouse, children or parents will be deported while they are away, and that its termination would both cause service members personal hardship and negatively affect their combat performance. Also in July 2019, Markey and 15 other Senate Democrats introduced the Protecting Sensitive Locations Act, which would require, except in special circumstances, that ICE agents get approval from a supervisor before engaging in enforcement actions at sensitive locations, and that agents receive annual training in addition to reporting annually on enforcement actions in those locations. In 2009, Bennett co-sponsored the Solar Manufacturing Jobs Creation Act, legislation that would have provided a tax credit to support solar manufacturing in the US. The legislation was not enacted. He was one of the handful of Democratic senators who have supported construction of the Keystone XL pipeline, voting for it in 2013, 2014 and 2015. In October 2017, Bennett was one of 19 senators to sign a letter to Administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, Scott Pruitt, questioning Pruitt's decision to repeal the Clean Power Act, asserting that Pruitt used mathematical sleights of hand to overstate the costs of industry compliance with the 2015 rule and understate the benefits that it will be lost if the 2017 repeal is finalised, and that science denial and math trick fail to satisfy the requirements of the law, nor will it slow the increase in frequency and intensity of extreme weather events, the inexorable rise in sea levels, or the other dire effects of global warming that our planet is already experiencing. In November 2018, Bennett was one of 25 Democratic senators to co-sponsor a resolution in response to findings of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report and the National Climate Assessment. The resolution affirmed the senators' acceptance of the findings and their support for bold action to address climate change. In March 2018, Bennett voted against tabling a resolution spearheaded by Bernie Sanders, Chris Murphy and Mike Lee that would have required President Trump to withdraw American troops either in or influencing Yemen within the next 30 days, unless they were combating al-Qaeda. In November 2018, Bennett joined Senators Chris Coons, Elizabeth Warren and a bipartisan group of lawmakers in sending the Trump administration a letter raising concerns about the People's Republic of China's undue influence on media outlets and academic institutions in the United States. They wrote, "In American news outlets, Beijing has used financial ties to suppress negative information about the CCP. In the past 4 years, multiple media outlets with direct or indirect financial ties to China allegedly decided not to publish stories on wealth and corruption in the CCP. In one case, an editor resigned due to mounting self-censorship in the outlet's China coverage. Beijing has also sought to use relationships with American academic institutions and student groups to shape public discourse." In April 2019, Bennett was one of 34 senators to sign a letter to President Trump regarding cutting aid to Central America. It encouraged Trump to listen to members of your own administration and reverse a decision that will damage our national security and aggravate conditions inside Central America, asserting that Trump had consistently expressed a flawed understanding of U.S. foreign assistance since becoming president, and that he was personally undermining efforts to promote U.S. national security and economic prosperity by preventing the use of fiscal year 2018 national security funding. The senators argued that foreign assistance to Central American countries created less migration to the U.S. by helping to improve conditions in these countries. Bennett has co-sponsored the bipartisan States Act, proposed in the 115th U.S. Congress by Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren and fellow Colorado Senator Cory Gardner, that would exempt individuals or corporations in compliance with state cannabis laws from federal enforcement of the Controlled Substances Act. In 2018, Bennett criticized the Trump administration for attempting to cherry-pick data to misinform the public on marijuana use. In response, the White House's Office of National Drug Control Policy committed to be completely objective and dispassionate in its analysis of marijuana. Bennett is a co-sponsor of the Safe Banking Act, which would provide marijuana businesses access to banking services. On January 24, 2009, Bennett gave an impassioned, impromptu 25-minute speech on the Senate floor in response to comments by Senator Ted Cruz. He questioned the authenticity of Cruz's concern about difficulties that the 2018 to 2019 government shutdown was causing to first responders, recalling that in 2013, Cruz led a shutdown that lasted 16 days at a time when Colorado was experiencing flooding. In less than 8 hours, the speech became the most-watched Senate floor speech in C-SPAN history. On January 23, 2019, Pete Buttigieg announced that he was creating an exploratory committee for a candidacy for President of the United States in the 2020 election. Buttigieg is seeking the Democratic nomination. If elected, he would be the youngest and first openly gay American president. He officially launched his campaign on April 14, 2019 in South Bend. Buttigieg describes himself as a progressive and a supporter of democratic capitalism. He favours universal health care with retention of private insurance, dialogue and cooperation between the Democratic Party and organised labour, universal background checks for firearms purchases, and environmentalist policies to combat pollution and climate change, which Buttigieg views as a national security threat. He supports subsidising solar panels and the Paris Agreement. After President Trump withdrew the United States from the Paris Agreement, Buttigieg was one of many US mayors to sign the Mayor's National Climate Action Agenda, pledging that his city would continue to adhere to the agreement. Buttigieg supports the Equality Act, a bill extending federal non-discrimination protection to LGBT people. He opposes the Trump administration's ban on transgender personnel. Buttigieg supports the DACA program and federal legislation that would create a pathway to citizenship for youths brought to the country illegally as children. He supports abortion rights. Buttigieg identifies regulatory capture as a significant problem in American society. Following the 2018 midterms, Tim Ryan was widely seen as a possible presidential hopeful for the 2020 presidential election. In February and March 2019, he travelled to early primary states such as Iowa and New Hampshire. Ryan's 2020 presidential campaign official began on April 4, 2019, when he announced that he would be running in the Democratic primaries. Ryan announced that he would seek a Democratic nomination for president during an interview on The View. Tulsi Gabbard was mentioned as a possible presidential candidate in 2016, and that year was assigned as Bernie Sanders' running mate in California for any write-in votes for Sanders. In May 2017, Gabbard announced that she had stopped accepting money from the defense industry and from PACs. In her first 3 terms, she accepted just under $0.12 million from military-industrial complex donors like BAE Systems, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and Raytheon. On February 2, 2019, Gabbard officially launched her 2020 presidential campaign, saying that it was in the spirit of service above self that she announced her candidacy. CNN described her foreign policy platform as anti-interventionist and her economic platform as populist. Politico described the campaign as in disarray, as campaign manager Rainier Batrice left the campaign after her unplanned announcement. along with the recent conflict surrounding her use of the term religious bigotry in speaking of Brian Boucher's confirmation hearings and the Daily Kos's decision to fund her opponent for her House seat, Gabbard also apologised for some of her former positions. After Gabbard announced her candidacy, RT, Sputnik News and Russia Insider ran about 20 stories favourable to her. NBC News reported that these outlets attempted to interfere with the 2016 United States elections. In Rolling Stone magazine, Matt Tabai called the NBC report a transparent hit piece. Likewise, in The Intercept, Glenn Greenwald criticised NBC's McCarthyite storyline and use of a cybersecurity firm as a source because the company had participated in what it alternately called a false flag operation or an experiment against a Republican candidate during the 2018 US legislative election. According to Google Trends, Gabbard has the most Google searches after the first 2020 Democratic debate, which aired on June 26, 2019. Search traffic was likely due to her being relatively unknown. A tweet from Gabbard's official Twitter account, signed by her sister, argued that debate host MSNBC allotted speaking time to the candidates unfairly. It's clear who MSNBC wants to be president, Elizabeth Warren. Cory Booker and Elizabeth Warren spoke for 11 and 9.5 minutes respectively, while Gabbard spoke for 6.5 minutes. As of this programme, there is a good possibility that even more hopeful young candidates will hit the campaign trail to try and make a real difference in this world. With such a variety of views and policies, the American people find themselves in the perfect position to institute true change and make the future a brighter place for all of us.